May the words from my lips and the meditation of each of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Life can be, and often is, deeply enriching. But it can have, and it often does have, its share of suffering, of loss, of sorrow. When we think of loss, we perhaps turn to the loss of a loved one and an opportunity to grieve and experience for ourselves the reality of that loss. And in these particular times when people have not been able to grieve with family and friends, then that's been particularly challenging. But there are other kinds of loss too. Loss of a valued friendship, financial loss, loss of employment, having a home burgled, ill health, loss of status through retirement. Loss comes in many and varied forms. And at such times we perhaps ask the question quite naturally, why me? Why has this happened to me? And how can I work this through? And who will be with me in my loss at this time? This morning our key reading is from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians and the opening verses. And the key message in the whole letter is this: God's power comes in our weakness, not in our strength. God's power comes in our weakness and not in our own strength. If you've got a Bible handy, you might like to look at that passage, 2 Corinthians chapter 1, and those opening verses, as we share those verses together. For I think three things stand out. And firstly, the suffering of Christ flows over into our own lives. And we'll look at verse 5 for that. The sufferings of Christ flow over into our own lives. There is a solidarity between Christ and his followers. Jesus spoke quite often, didn't he, of the fact that his followers would suffer as he had suffered. And in his opening verses we have the word comfort, which presupposes suffering, mentioned 10 times. Trouble is mentioned 3 times, and suffering is mentioned 4 times. It's going to happen. It's part of our relationship with Christ, but we don't go through it alone. What about Paul's suffering that he speaks about in verse 4? The Greek has the notion of pressure, something that Paul constantly felt as he sought to minister for Christ. I'm sure he faced many of the same problems that we face today, but his key problem, as it were, was his relationship with Christ, and that caused his loss in many ways. Difficult to take that on, isn't it? It was his faithful to Christ that was the source of his loss. Well, secondly, we see in verse 3 that God comforts us. He is a compassionate Father. Isaiah the prophet wrote, "As a mother comforts her children, so I, God, will comfort you." And it's through Christ that this comfort comes and brings compassion and healing. And thirdly, we are to comfort others too. We find that in verse 4. What we receive from Christ, we have to give to others. And I wonder if this is a feature of the way that we live our lives day by day. For this is the heart of how we deal with loss. I'm going to come back to that a little later. It's very easy to preach a gospel of prosperity and health, but Paul speaks of suffering. We're not promised instant healing. We're not promised success. We're promised something far greater. We see that in verse 6. We're promised God's comfort. If we go to the end of our passage, verses 8 to 11, we see how Paul begins to expand on his own loss, his own troubles. And verse 8 could really be rewritten. We were indescribably beyond the limits of our own powers, brought down into the depths. We were struggling. We didn't have the strength of our own to cope with what was happening to us. And what was it? Well, we're not told. Something happened in Asia. Maybe it was a serious illness. Probably it was what happened in Acts chapter 19, when Paul had to face those riots at Ephesus. And yet, despite that loss, he still relied on God. Despite that loss, he still set his hopes on God. So he didn't ask those questions, why me? What have I done to deserve this? Rather, it helped him to have an even deeper trust in God. For God is not only the God who raised Jesus from the dead. He's a God who continues to this very moment to meet us in our loss and in our grief and in our suffering and in our sorrow. I will comfort and sustain you. But let's note this. This isn't the same as saying, follow me, you'll have an easy life. For whether we like it or not, in our humanity, we're caught up in life's sorrows, in life's sufferings, in life's loss. And that's why the need to comfort one another is so crucial to us. Well, what sort of comfort are we talking about? Can I suggest it's not always appropriate to offer those lovely Bible verses that it's so easy to say, look at this verse, may that be a blessing to you. That may come later. We need to get alongside people in real and sometimes costly ways, because offering comfort isn't very easy. But if our faith is real, if we experience God's comfort for ourselves, then we have no alternative but to offer that comfort to others. Many years ago, whilst I was still teaching, I applied for a job as chaplain at a fairly prestigious public school. And quite unexpectedly, I was offered the job. And the headmaster said, I'm writing a letter of acceptance, and you get a letter in the post and you'll find very favourable terms. Well, the letter arrived, but there's no job. Evidently the chaplain who'd offered his resignation came to the headmaster's house late that night in tears and said, I can't leave. So the letter said, I'm sorry there's no job, but here's a book token for your troubles. And remember, we read in Romans, you know the verse, all things work together for good for those who love him. Now I know that verse is true. I've experienced it in my own life. I've seen it in the life of others. But at that moment, that was no comfort to me. It's not what I needed to hear. I did write back. I sent in the book token. And I thought, well, if you can play Bible games, then I can too. And I said, a Christian's word is his bond. Not a very good thing to do, looking back. And I never heard from him again. Not long afterwards, I was offered a job as a consultant for the church in the east of England. So things did work together for God, for good. God was at work. but a word of comfort at that time was no comfort. Ed Walker is a very good friend of our son, and for 9 years he worked in Darfur, in a war zone, working for Tear Fund. And he developed a real passion for the poor. When he came back to England with his wife, then that passion continued. And he tells that he received quite unexpectedly an inheritance of £30,000. And he thought, well, I don't need this, what can I do with it? And working with his local church, they put that money with others to get a mortgage on a property. And that was used to house 2 homeless people. And that led to a charity which Ed now runs called Hope into Action. And in the past 10 years, they've managed to fund 70 homes for homeless people. And most of those has gone on to make real progress. They've won many awards for their work. And if it was adopted by the government, it would save millions of pounds. But because they're a faith organisation, they struggle for that funding. He's written a book called A House Built on Love, and if you want to challenge about your own Christian life, then do get hold of the book. But it's not an easy read. His vision is to see every church having a home for homeless people. But the point I want to make is that they don't just provide a home and say, get on with it. They offer loving, genuine comfort. At times that love is rejected. But their criteria of success is, did I show love? And he writes these words. We offer unconditional, non-judgmental listening. As I read through the scriptures, I see that Jesus was not just a great preacher and healer, but also a fabulous listener. Time and time again, we see him starting conversations with a question. Jesus was asked 80 questions and many didn't answer. But he asked 300 questions. To be like Christ, he writes, is to ask 4 times as many questions as we are asked. It's to be constantly listening. It's from a place of really hearing people that we can build relationships, trust, confidence, and hope for change. Listening is the impetus to action. When we think about loss and the need for comfort, I think what Ed Walker is doing really sets the target for us. Comfort can be costly in many ways, but it is the way of Christ.